Over the past several days, 3 females have been found dead.
Looks like someone's going after these girls.
Then they have to know to watch their backs.
Streaming March 13th.
You really want what happened to this woman? That happened to you?
Exactly why I need to keep going on this.
Starring Emmy Award winner Amanda Seyfried.
I'm worried about what you're gonna find. So am I.
Long Bright River. A limited series. Streaming March 13th. Only on Peacock.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. From your morning podcast to your afternoon playlist, State Farm knows you personalize your entire day. And that's why State Farm helps you personalize your insurance with the State Farm Personal Price Plan. It offers coverage options that help protect what you care about most at an affordable price just for you. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Prices vary by state. Options selected by customer. Availability and eligibility may vary.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I'm very pleased to welcome to the show for the very first time, Adam Pennington. Adam, welcome.
Hello, how are you?
I'm well. I'm kind of excited to talk about this topic today because I don't know if you know this or if the listeners really know this, but like the Plantagenets were my first love.
Okay.
How can you not love... Yeah, I mean, how do you not love 300 years of royal drama, right?
I am fast becoming just as, if not marginally more fascinated by the Plantagenets than I am the Tudors, because it's over 300, to your point, it's over 300 years. It's so dramatic. And because they're less covered than the Tudors, they're not as saturated. You know, there's so much still to learn, and many of them have never been portrayed in film and television, so the Tudors tend to dominate, but I love the Plantagenets. I think they're a fascinating bunch.
Okay, before we get into the topic of your book, I have to ask you, do you have a favorite Plantagenet monarch?
Edward IV.
Mm.
Yeah, big soft spot. And it's not just Max Irons.
Come on, he is pretty hot.
That's always, whenever someone says, I always say I've got a real soft spot for Edward IV. They go, is it Max Irons? I'm like, well, it helps. But I was, funnily enough, I was saying this on my podcast the other day about Edward IV. I don't know why, but I've just got a theory that he was probably a fairly decent guy. Now, I appreciate he had his brother executed, which isn't the nicest. But maybe we're saying this with hindsight, but he didn't seem to be disappointed by the fact that he had daughters first. Elizabeth Woodville had 3 daughters before she had a son, and from the records, there's nothing to suggest that he was disappointed. Now, maybe we're saying that with hindsight because he went on to have sons, but I don't know, he just seems like he had been fun, a nice guy, ruthless, but he needed to be. But yeah, I'd say Edward IV.
Yeah, good answer. That would be my answer too. But I'm obsessed with Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. And when The White Queen came out, I mean, I read the book first and I absolutely loved the book. But when the series came out, when you bring these figures from history to life, and of course you have these super attractive actors involved, it's going to draw more interest to the time period, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say that it was actually The White Queen that was, and I appreciate, it's a work of fiction, but it was The White Queen that drew me in quite a lot to the world of the Plantagenets. Until then, I'd been quite focused on the Tudors, but not the Tudors, the TV show, which I thought was abysmal, but the Tudors themselves. But now I'm fully in love with all of the Plantagenet story, and as you tend to do as well, I'm now going even further back. I recently watched Vikings Valhalla, which has got Canute and Emma of Normandy, and I'm finding myself becoming more and more interested in that window as well. So, yeah, it's just one of those things.
There's something to be said about historical series. It really does pique your interest. And the Vikings Valhalla, too. That's another one that I absolutely loved and started diving deeper. I'm obsessed with the Norman conquest. So to be able to see that side of the story, too, just kind of like it just brings it to life and shows you that these were real people and we get to see it.
Have you heard about the 1066 drama that's coming out this year?
I thought I saw something, but tell me more about it.
It's literally about the lead up to the Battle of Hastings. And Nikolai Coster-Waldau, Jaime Lannister, if you watched Game of Thrones, he is playing William the Conqueror.
Ooh.
And James Norton is playing Harold Godwinson. I think Harriet Walt is in it. Yeah, it's. I think it's coming out in April, so not that long.
Oh, goodness. See, and I was trying to start a second podcast where I was talking about William the Conqueror. I don't think I'm going to get it done before the series comes out. Oh, well.
Around the corner as well for you now as well, though, haven't you?
What's that?
You've got Wolf Hall season 2 around the corner as well now, haven't you?
Yes, I'm so jealous that you guys got it so much earlier than we did. Was it spectacular?
Yeah, it's amazing. It's really, really good. My only complaint, and it's sort of quite timely, really, based on today's conversation, is the lack of Margaret Pole. Because when they announced the casting of Harriet Walter, a dame, you know, in the series, and she features in the trailer, she's one of the stills. She's in one scene, literally for 2 minutes in episode 1. That's it. Which is annoying. But I believe a lot more was filmed that just didn't make the cut. So I think my only complaint is that actually they could have made it 10 episodes rather than 6. Because there were a few things that, unless you know the story, particularly of the Pole family, actually, that people might be scratching their heads a little bit. But it is magnificent, and Mark Rylance breaks your heart at the end of it for obvious reasons as to what happens.
Yeah. That whole the series, just fantastic. It's such a great, like the filming of it. I always remark on how I love that it was filmed in natural light to really give us an idea what it was like to live back then. Yeah,
and you almost feel like the filming style was almost done in such a way that you feel like you're sort of perched on Cromwell's shoulder. You know, you're following him, and a lot of people really disliked Claire Foy's interpretation of Anne Boleyn. I loved it. I thought it was magnificent. I thought she was amazing in the role. And I actually really liked the relationship between Anne and Cromwell, as she called him. I thought it was brilliant. And a real highlight of season 2 that you've got to look forward to is Timothy Spall as the Duke of Norfolk. Obviously, Bernard Hill died. Timothy Spall was cast in his place, and he is so unlikable. It's unbelievable. You just want to scream at the TV. But he's incredible in the part, and comes across certainly as how I think the Duke of Norfolk probably was.
You know, that's one of the things. I was just talking with a friend about this yesterday, about how, you know, Gene Hackman recently passed away, and she's
weird, that story.
Isn't it?
So odd.
Yeah.
But they were reading yesterday that him and his wife are partially mummified. I mean, it's all very weird.
It is. I think there's going to be a lot more that comes out with that story. Right now, I don't know what to believe, you know?
Yeah, it's very odd.
But I was telling a friend about it, and she said, yeah, you know, I said, he always played the bad guy in movies. And she's like, oh, I just never liked him. And I said, that's how you know that he's a good actor. If he does such a good job that it makes you not like him.
Yeah, I remember talking about Game of Thrones a moment ago. I remember reading that George R.R. Martin said to the guy that played Joffrey, everyone hates you, well done.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. Well, Adam, today I welcomed you to the show because we're going to talk about your book, and make sure I don't have it in front of me. So I think it was called Henry VIII and the Plantagenet Poles. Is that right?
Yeah, Henry VIII and the Plantagenet Poles, the rise and fall of a dynasty.
Perfect. So for those who are unfamiliar with the Poles, why don't you give us a little backstory on who the Poles were?
Sure. So the most well-known member of the Pole family is the matriarch of the family, Lady Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. And the reason she's significant is that her family name, her name at birth was Plantagenet. She was a Plantagenet member she was a member of the Plantagenet family. She was so you had Edward IV and you had Richard III, and they had a middle brother, George, Duke of Clarence, and Margaret Pole was George, Duke of Clarence's daughter, and then she had a younger brother, Edward, Earl of Warwick. So we're talking about a woman who was the niece of two of England's kings. Her mother was the elder of the two daughters born to Richard, Earl of Warwick, so Isabel. Her younger sister, Anne, marries Richard III. So we've got a woman. So Margaret's mother is England's richest heiress. Her father is a royal duke. So she is absolutely at the sort of the top of society. And because of that, she has a prominent role at the courts of her two uncles. The Tudors then come along, and obviously all of that changes because Margaret and her family, and the other, what we refer to as the White Rose Network, so the families that had strong York blood, the De la Poles, the Exeters, the Lyles, the Staffords, all of these families go from being members of the royal family into ready-made affronts, essentially, to the House of Tudor. So Henry VII comes along, and one of the first things he does is to imprison Margaret's younger brother, Edward, Earl of Warwick, because he's the last male Plantagenet. So he puts him in the Tower at the age of 10. But with the female Yorks, he marries them off to neutralise them as threats. Obviously, he marries the most coveted prize among the York princesses, Elizabeth herself. Margaret is married off to a man called Sir Richard Pole, which is why they're known as the Pole family. And he was basically a nobody. So his grandfather was a half sibling to Margaret Beaufort, so Henry VII's mother. That's his only link to any form of grandeur. So, and to put into perspective just the difference in what Margaret was born to what she ended up marrying, so Richard Pole came with an income of £50 a year and 2 properties. Margaret's father's income had been £6,000, and her mother had lands from Cornwall to Scotland. So the disparity between what she was born to what she ended up marrying was just insane. I mean, literally insane. And a lot of people really commented that it was a shamefully poor wedding for a girl born all but a princess. It did provide security, though, and safety, and the couple had 5 children, 4 boys, Henry, Arthur, Geoffrey, and Reginald, and a daughter, Ursula, who was born between Arthur and Reginald. Sadly for Margaret's brother, Edward, Earl of Warwick, he never left the Tower of London's walls, and he was eventually executed when he was 24. Now, although it's generally considered that he was executed because he became inadvertently involved in the whole Perkin Warbeck affair, that was only part of it, and really the putting the seal on it was the fact that Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain would not allow Catherine of Aragon to leave Spain to journey to England for her marriage to Prince Arthur until the most prominent claimants to the throne had been dealt with, of which Edward, Earl of Warwick was at the top. So that's who Margaret Pole was and her family. As far as how things then change when Henry VIII comes along, it's a whole different story.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places. Between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
BTW, FYI. Visit Nexplanon.com RN to learn about Nexplanon. It's an gestural implant, 68 milligrams radio pain. Or ask your HCP IRL. Okay, TTYL.
Yeah, to be a Plantagenet during the reign of Henry VIII was not really a safe life, was it?
It was at the start. He was so Henry VII kept them downtrodden because he was all Lancastrian, and even we all know the Tudors had basically no right to the throne. I mean, they really did not have. It's a bit like me, going up to King Charles and saying, "Excuse me, I should be king." They just, they just didn't have a very good claim. But Henry VIII was obviously a very different man to his father, and in the early years of his reign, he treated the White Rose families very, very well, actually, for obvious reasons. Firstly, he was half York himself, and it was, he adored his mother. That was well known. He was very like his grandfather, Edward IV. They were said to be very much alike, similar build, similar personalities. And at the start of his reign, as I've said, he actually showed a lot of favour to the White Rose Network. And more, I think the most favour was shown to Margaret Pole, because when Richard Pole had died, he died quite unexpectedly. The small amount of money that he was bringing in was reverted back to the crown. So Margaret was effectively destitute at one point, and it got so severe that she had to seek sanctuary and ended up having to give her third son, Reginald, over to the church, just as a means of alleviating some of the financial pressure. That all changes when Henry VIII comes along, because one of the first things he does, obviously, is to marry Catherine of Aragon. And by this point, Catherine and Margaret had formed a close relationship, a good friendship, because Margaret had been around Catherine during that short window that her and Prince Arthur were married, because Margaret's husband, Richard, was the guardian of Prince Arthur. And it seems likely that it was under Catherine of Aragon's under Catherine's suggestion that Margaret approached Henry VIII to reinstate the lost titles and land that had been taken from her. Now, initially, she had hoped to win them back for her heir, Henry, but Henry VIII did something very unusual. He said, no, these will go to you. We're going to make you a peeress in your own right. So that's how she became the Countess of Salisbury. And that was extremely unusual. And it meant that she was when we look at the list of the top 10 richest peers in England at the time, Margaret's number 5 on the list, a list which is exclusively male, except for her. She's in a different position to basically all other women in England in many ways. And Henry VIII then shows a lot of favour to Margaret's sons, particularly Arthur and Reginald. So things really changed for the good, actually, at the start of Henry VIII's reign for Margaret.
Yeah, Margaret and Reginald are probably the two Poles that people are going to recognize the most. Which one of them, or was there another one, that got you interested in doing this topic for the book?
I think it actually came down to when it dawned on me just how tenuous the claim to the throne the Tudors had, and the fact that I conclude that actually the strongest claim, by the time we get to the Exeter conspiracy, which is much later and the thing that ultimately brings the Pole family down, by that point, I conclude that they've got the strongest claim to the throne of England of any of the families, because it passes in the male line, because it's via George, Duke of Clarence, and whether we like it or not, this is a time when, if it passes in the male line, it's seen as more favourable. So that was the reason why I wanted to tell the story. But also, I wanted to... What a lot of people don't know about this story is actually that there is this much bigger thing going on called the Exeter conspiracy. Most people know that Margaret Pole is executed, and they know that she was elderly by the standards of the time, and most people think she ran around a scaffold being hacked apart. That didn't happen, mercifully. Now, her execution was badly botched, but it wasn't as dramatic as we're told. So actually my desire was to tell the story, I suppose, make people more aware that there was this much bigger thing going on. That it wasn't... Henry VIII is the king famous for turning on wives, ministers, his members of his council, but there's a window where he turns on his own family. Because they were all members of his family, they were all cousins, and that window isn't discussed very much, which is why I wanted to write the book, I should say.
You mentioned the Exeter conspiracy, and when I was in England last June, I went to Exeter, which has become one of my favorite places. That's just so much history in Exeter. And I was in the Devon area a lot. And one of the things that I realized about Devon is that it appears that Henry VII and his mother, Margaret Beaufort, knew that part of the country was going to be some trouble, that there was some families that were living there who could stir up some things. And I think I was shown a place, I visited so many places, I couldn't even tell you where it is. I have a picture of it, But there's a place in Devon where Margaret Beaufort had a home, and it just so happened to be close enough for her to keep an eye on some of these families who could stir up trouble. There's like a lot of these little names planted all over the countryside where it was like they were keeping a watchful eye on that area to make sure there weren't any rebellions. And I just thought that was absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, all of those things, they're scattered all over the place. And that's the thing about England. Everywhere you turn, there's little bits of history, just even in place names. You know, down the road from me, there's an Anne Boleyn's Walk. One of the roads is called Anne Boleyn's Walk. You get it everywhere.
Everywhere. Yeah, you are so lucky. You know, here in America, we just wish we had all of that history. You could walk by a place in England and not know that it has centuries of history or the links to the Tudors or the Plantagenets.
Oh, massively. I mean, I'm very lucky because I grew up in on the borders between South London and Surrey, which is very heavily concentrated around, Hampton Court Palace is a 15-minute drive away. And the park I go to every day, where I take my dog for a walk, and I grew up in a house basically overlooking this park, is Nonsuch Park, which is the home of the Lost Palace of Nonsuch. And so called because there'd been none such like it. And that's why it was called Nonsuch. It was that grand. Sadly, there's nothing left there other than a few markers to tell us where the palace stood. But that's where I go every day for a walk with my dog.
And you probably take it for granted at this point, don't you?
Yeah, it's my favourite place in the world, I will admit, because it's so... Growing up, it's where I learned to ride a bike. It's where we took the dogs when I was little. So it's sort of a part of me in many ways.
Oh, I love that. That is so great. Well, I'd love to talk a little bit about Reginald Pole, if you don't mind, and his connection with Henry VIII and all the things that Henry did for him before Reginald became a thorn in his side.
Yes, thorn in his side is putting it mildly. Reginald is, to your point a few minutes ago, other than Margaret, the Pole that most people have heard of, or at least know vaguely. Reginald Pole was initially really supported by the king. So he became a great scholar, and Henry VIII saw him as being a good scholarly presence in Italy, representing England. They are related, they're cousins. So Henry VIII pays for his university career at Padua and Rome. Because of his going to church at a young age, it was sort of always destined that he would go into the church as a career, which is why he never marries. And Henry VIII really supported him, as I say, paid for his education, and that enabled Reginald to have an amazing career and spend a lot of time in Italy. Things change between Reginald and Henry when Anne Boleyn comes along, ultimately. Like most things, it changes the relationship. The reason that Reginald has become well known is that whilst he was in Italy, obviously Henry VIII was looking to lots of members of his court to try and help him get the annulment from Catherine of Aragon so as to marry Anne Boleyn. He lent on his senior courtiers to really try and convince the Pope and all the rest of it. And Reginald gave every sign that he would be willing to do that and that he would show his support for the king and that he would send his response soon. He eventually sent his response 2 months after Anne Boleyn is executed. So that tells you how long he was dragging this out. And what he sent was not what the king wanted to hear. Now, it's called a letter, but it's actually a small book, really, called De Unitate. And De Unitate is a blistering attack on Henry VIII. He calls him a Nero. He likens him to Caligula. He accuses him of destroying the best men in the kingdom. So that is Bishop Fisher and Thomas More. Yeah, and he just goes in on Henry, essentially. And understandably, this does not go down well with the king. And Margaret Pole and her heir, Henry, who became Baron Montague when the titles were reinstated, are called before the king to explain what on earth's going on. They effectively throw Reginald under the bus and say, no, we'll stay loyal to you, meaning the king. Now, it's my firm belief that they're just saying what the king wants to hear. It's lip service. But they side with the king and send letters to Reginald saying that he's effectively, he's cut off from the family if he continues. But as I say, I think that's firmly them just saying what they know that the king wanted to hear.
Yeah, they were like, wink, wink.
Yeah. Well, I mean, by the time that Margaret's examined, by the time we get to the Exeter conspiracy, because when Reginald was doing all of this, there were assassins sent into Europe to try and kill him. Francis Bryan, the one-eyed, patched rogue of Henry's court, was sent to try and kill Reginald. And when Margaret finds out that he has escaped and survived, she's asked, "Are you pleased?" And she says, "Yes, of course I'm pleased. I'm his mother."
Right.
But, equally, she'd also said that he was dead to her. So it was kind of... That's why I conclude ultimately in the book that I think she told the truth the whole time, because she said things that she knew would not go down well. Saying that I'm happy he survived, she knew could be a bit contentious, which is why I conclude that she ultimately told the truth. But yeah, he was a real problem, and I actually say in the book that the Exeter conspiracy should just be rechristened the Problem Pole. Because it's really down to Reginald that it all kicked off.
Yeah, yeah. So, one of the things about Margaret Pole and her sons, of course, ending up in the Tower of London, and Reginald's off safely and on the continent or in Europe. And what did life look like for Margaret and her children while Reginald is gone? They're trying to stay alive. Did you find any evidence that they were actually conspiring against the king?
No. I don't believe that they were conspiring. I believe they were moaning about the changes at the court. But the problem that they faced is that some of the things that certainly Henry Pole, so the eldest of the Pole sons, and Geoffrey Pole said crossed into treason based on the 1534 Treasons Act. So when there was that update to the Treasons Act in 1534, where it was said that speaking, but even thinking about the king's death was treason, some of the things that both men said crossed that line. Now, whilst to us, that is just people talking, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were going to try and kill the king, but we have to bear in mind that under the law of the time that had crossed into treason. It's the reason why actually Anne Boleyn is guilty, because if she said the "you look for dead men's shoes" quote, if she said that, which all the evidence suggests she did, then technically she was guilty of treason. Now, do I believe she was guilty of everything else? Of course not. Clearly innocent. But if we're basing things solely on that law, she crossed the line in saying that, as did the Pole boys. And to explain it in a bit more detail, I mean, to try and explain the full Exeter conspiracy, I'd need to be with you for about a month. But in a nutshell, firstly, it's called the Exeter conspiracy because the most senior person who became wrapped up in it was Henry Courtenay, the Marquis of Exeter. And at its crux, the theory was that the intention was to place him on the throne instead. It all starts, really, the spotlight lands on these families because of Reginald. Had Reginald not been doing what he was doing, or had Henry VIII got to him, I think all of it would have it wouldn't have even come out. It wouldn't have been a thing. But basically, the two main issues are Reginald and then the youngest of the Pole boys, Geoffrey. Because Geoffrey, like lots of other fourth-born sons of noble houses, didn't have much of an official role and had even less money and had a huge family, 12 children, constantly burdened by debt. And so when obviously the Reformation took place and the monasteries and everything were being closed down, this really upset the Pole family. The Poles were traditional Catholics. They were not open to religious reform. And like the other older noble houses, they also struggled with people like Cromwell, because obviously they were from an royal family, really. And like the Howards and the other big noble houses, they struggled with what Cromwell was. And in so Hampshire in the south of England was a county over which Margaret Pole had quite a lot of land and quite a lot of influence, and she had a hospital within her lands at Warblington Castle, which was her favoured home. And a man turned up there called Gervase Tyndall, who we now know was effectively a spy sent by Cromwell. And whilst he's there, he started to just chat to a man called Richard Eyre, who was the man that ran the hospital. And he found out via Richard Eyre that Geoffrey Pole had been communicating with Reginald. And he'd used a go-between, a man called Hugh Holland, to convey letters from Geoffrey over to Reginald. And the contents of these letters were effectively saying, I need to leave England. I'm so burdened by debt. I don't want to be in England anymore. The country I don't recognise the place any longer, kind of thing. When Hugh Holland gets back to England, he is promptly arrested, and Geoffrey is arrested shortly after. And he's taken to the Tower of London, and although he wouldn't have been tortured because he was noble, he may have had very severe psychological pressure placed on him. And he began to talk, and he started to... Well, he said, for example, that his older brother, Henry, had said that the world had come to stripes. And although it's difficult to know exactly what he means with that, but it's my belief that, and there is some sense to this from what I've read of other people's work as well. Even back then, you know how stripes are kind of synonymous with what people wear in prison? It was kind of the same back then. So maybe what he was saying is that under Henry VIII, criminals effectively are running the country. Is kind of my reading of what he meant by that. And then he also said that Henry Pole had said that the king's sore leg would eventually kill him. So that's what I mean when I say that if he did say that, it crosses that line. And then the Marquis of Exeter gets sort of lumped in with it, should I say, because Henry Courtenay, the Marquis of Exeter, was a privy councillor because he was one of the most senior nobles in the country. Henry Pole wasn't a councillor, but Henry Courtenay was. The two men were very close. They were related, like all of the families were. And according to Geoffrey, Reginald was given secrets that were told to Henry Pole. So basically, Henry Pole knew things from Privy Council meetings that the things he knew only came from meetings that Henry Courtenay was sitting on. And so the inference was that Henry Courtenay is telling things to Henry Pole that he shouldn't be saying, and those are then being leaked to Reginald. Because Reginald is also, when the Pilgrimage of Grace broke out in 1538, Reginald was trying to convince the Pope to fully sanction an invasion alongside the rebels and sort of really lend support. So if letters are making their way to Reginald containing things from Privy Council meetings, that is massively problematic. So that is what leads to the arrest of lots of all these other people. In the end, there are 13 arrests, including, so you have Henry Pole and then you have Henry Courtenay. Henry Courtenay's wife, Gertrude, is arrested. Their young son is arrested. And eventually, of course, Margaret is arrested, Margaret Pole. Now, it's my belief that Margaret wasn't involved in anything. I mean, as I said earlier, I don't actually think that any of them were planning a rebellion, because had they wanted to revolt against the king, they had their chance during the Pilgrimage of Grace. Had these families joined up, then they could have seriously helped overthrow the king, but they didn't. In fact, they did the opposite. They lent support. Henry Baron Montague gave 200 of his men to help fighting against the rebels. So I don't believe there was this concerted plan to topple Henry VIII. I just think it got to a point where the old families no longer recognised the country that they were in and were moaning about it, basically. And that then, and because there was such a spotlight on them because of Reginald, that's what I mean when I say, had Reginald not done what he'd done, I don't think any of this would have happened. Because Cromwell knew that the way to get to Reginald was to turn on his family, really. And Margaret is she's put under house arrest at first, and the general consensus was that if her sons had been acting treasonously, that she must therefore be either involved herself or just aware of it. So that's what eventually led to her arrest. I'll pause there in case you want to ask her any sort of follow-up question. I realize I've just spoken at you solidly for about 15 minutes there.
No, you know what? That's okay. I would like to look at the timeline a little bit because I'm trying to remember the years and how this all plays out. Do you remember what year it was that Margaret was arrested?
Yeah, so she was arrested the first arrests take place in the summer of 1538. And then the arrests of Margaret's son and the other noblemen comes in November of that year. And then in early December, Henry Baron Montague, Henry Courtenay, and I can't remember his name now, one of the other noblemen, they're all beheaded on the same day. So Edward Neville is the third one. So Edward Neville was beheaded. The three of them are beheaded on the same day. And the laymen, the men who are not noble, so Hugh Holland, the guy that was the go-between, and a couple of other people that were involved are hung, drawn and quartered.
Wow.
Margaret's arrested in November, but is under house arrest. She is then transferred over to the house of the Earl of Southampton, at Cowdray House, and him and Thomas Goodrich, who was the Bishop of Ely, then begin a questioning process. And this lasts for actually quite a few months. There's about a 5-month window where they're just questioning her, and they cannot find anything to really pin against her. She is totally, the Earl of Southampton actually says in a letter to Cromwell, she's either the most errant traitress that ever lived or a perfect saint, because they just can't find anything to pin against her. Then suddenly a tunic is discovered, and this tunic has the pansy, which is the Pole family sigil, with the Tudor rose interconnected, and it was believed that this was proof that Margaret had this plan to eventually marry Reginald to Princess Mary. Now, that might have been the case, or it could have just been a tunic that she had made to show her connection to the Tudor household. It's more like, it's my belief it was made up, that Cromwell, just because we know that Cromwell made up the evidence against Anne Boleyn. We know that he literally made it up. So this is a man not above making up evidence. So it's my belief that the tunic was probably a forgery, a fake created.
Yeah.
But that is what then allows an attainder to be passed. And Margaret doesn't go to trial. There's an attainder against her, and she's sentenced to death. And it's at that point that she is then transferred over to the Tower. But what's really unusual about Margaret is that she's imprisoned for 2.5 years before being executed. Executions are normally very quick. George Boleyn was executed just 2 days after his trial. Margaret's in the Tower for nearly 3 years. And it must have been so disheartening, because Gertrude Courtenay, the wife of the Marquis of Exeter, there is so much more to pin against Gertrude Courtenay than there is Margaret Pole. But she's eventually released. And it's my belief that she is released because Gertrude married a Plantagenet. Margaret was one. She posed that greater threat in many ways. But she's in the Tower of London. I think had Reginald been captured, or if he even just apologised, I think things could have been very different for Margaret, and that she probably would have eventually been released. It got back actually to Catherine Howard, because by this point she's queen. that Margaret's situation in the Tower was getting worse. She's an elderly lady. She's in her late 60s, which is in your 90s by modern standards. And Catherine Howard actually sought the approval of the king to send Margaret some furs and some new shoes and stuff, which he agreed to. So these are signs maybe that he was sort of, softening, I suppose, maybe to Margaret. But then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, in May of 1541, Catherine Howard and Henry go on a progress to the north of England. And before leaving, they basically Henry gives the order, okay, clear the Tower out while we're gone, clear it out of prisoners. So that's what then led to Margaret's execution.
Okay, so I want to go back a little bit because the first house arrest was in 1538. And if we look at the timeline here, well, we have Prince Edward was born in 1537. Jane Seymour died in 1537. So Henry VIII is sitting there with his male heir. He is unmarried. He's a widower at this point. And I suspect, and you can disagree with me if you think, but I suspect this was all a way to secure his son's throne. You know, if they were indeed planning to wed Reginald to his daughter Mary, well, that's a threat, right, to Henry VIII's succession.
Yeah, I don't think that was going on specifically about the succession. I actually think that the main issue that the family faced was Cromwell, actually. Reginald is undoubtedly the ticking time bomb here. But because the Pole family were powerful, very wealthy, huge amounts of land that they oversaw, and were committed to the traditional Catholic faith, I think Thomas Cromwell knew that they could be a problem with getting the Reformation to the stages that he wanted it. And we know that Margaret, I mean, it was pretty brave of her, but also actually kind of inappropriate. But she, such was her power over the county of Hampshire that when that spy of Thomas Cromwell, Gervase Tyndall, went down to the hospital, he discovered that Margaret's, the bishops and the churchmen on her lands regularly broke the rules of confession, telling Margaret things that, well, as we know, that's totally inappropriate. These were meant to be things you didn't break. And the inference there was that Margaret was getting this information because she wanted to know if people within her lands and people that worked for her retainers and so on, held reformist leanings. And if they did, that she could then sort of come down on them, I guess. So I think more broadly, it's actually the fact that just by dint of who these people are, they've got this royal blood. So Thomas Cromwell could play on that. He could play on Henry VIII's suspicions because the way that Henry VII and Henry VIII behave, I think, is all based on and propelled by this. They must have had the knowledge that they didn't really belong on the throne. I think that would have been quite an acute imposter syndrome, certainly in the early days. And because Henry VIII goes through such a tough time in getting a son, and he knew himself he was the spare heir, yes, I think he definitely wanted more children. But I don't think that his turning on the White Rose network was driven by the fact that he only had Edward. I think it was more actually Cromwell playing on Henry's insecurities, because Cromwell knew that with these families around, his plans were going to be much more challenged.
Cromwell, man, that guy, he knew how to get into it, didn't he?
Yeah, but in the end, he suffered himself. So it's funny, isn't it, with Cromwell? We were talking about Wolf Hall earlier. Yeah. Wolf Hall has sort of humanized Cromwell to a lot of people, and actually made a lot of people think twice about Thomas More, which I've always felt was the case anyway. But it's an interesting one. But yeah, Cromwell, I think it was a combination of him and then obviously what Reginald was doing.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about Margaret Pole's end, because you alluded to this too. And in your book, you mentioned that, she was arrested. She was in the Tower. And when her end came, it came quicker than it should have. She should have been allowed more time. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, she was basically woken up at 7 a.m. and said, right, today's the day, you've got an hour, pretty much. And that is, there was something at the time known as mors improviso, which is basically something that people wanted to avoid, was mors improviso, which basically meant a sudden death, because this is an age of fervent religious belief. Margaret is very religious, very pious, traditional Catholic, and people at this time who held that level of conviction wanted time to be at peace in body and soul. So a sudden death was just something that kind of robbed people of that window to really just put themselves at ease. So there's that going on, and the fact that, she's awoken and told today's the day. And such was the speed of this that there is no scaffold. And that's how we know that the legend about her running around a scaffold is made up. There were only about 150 people to witness the execution, and there wasn't even a proper block. From the accounts, it was basically more akin to a log on the ground, and it was so low that she actually had to lie down. She couldn't even kneel, she had to lie down. Wow. And because the regular Tower executioner had gone north with the king, an axe was basically put into the hands of a teenage boy. Away you go. I mean, it was really, and it was badly botched, very badly botched. We don't know exactly how many blows, but there's been accounts. It could have been anywhere up to 10. So yeah, it was horrendously botched. But the legend about her running around a scaffold is not true. But yeah, an awful, awful end. And she was then buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, and her remains were among those that were uncovered and examined during the reign of Queen Victoria. Now, we can't say for certain whether they are definitely, like Alf Hawkins at the Tower is adamant, none of those bones belong to the people that are there. But the bones that are said to belong to Margaret Pole, when they were examined, they said two things. Firstly, these belong to a woman of advanced years, and that she was unusually tall for the time. But that's all we have to go on, sadly.
Interesting. And the story about her running around the scaffold, do you know when that originated?
It came along later, about a century or so later. Off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly where it started, but yeah, it was about a century or so later.
It always seems to be that way, doesn't it? These scandalous stories come out 100 years later, like, oh yeah, this is what happened. She was running around, her head was half hanging off.
Well, there's that, and the fact that she refused to lay her head on the block. That's why the executioner swung down, and at that point she jumped up. And I just think, this woman is nearly 70. She's been imprisoned for 3 years. She isn't running around a scaffold being hacked apart. It's just not happening.
Right. And if she's almost laying down on the ground, putting her head on the log, at that age, you're not even going to be able to jump up that fast. Exactly.
But yeah. So it was, I mean, the single biggest surprise, actually, I think, of the whole thing is that Geoffrey gets off. I mean, that's the wild part of it as well. He attempts suicide twice in the Tower, which is, in an age, as I said a moment ago, of fervent religious belief. That was the gravest of sins. I mean, to commit suicide was just a no-no. And he attempts to stab himself the first time, and then he attempts to smother himself, and obviously neither times it worked. And I think he does that because he had given so much information about his brother. He didn't actually say anything about his mother, Margaret, but I think that guilt is what drove him into attempting suicide. Now, whether he was given a pardon because he was either deemed insane by this point, and at this point you can't execute the insane. So it's either that, or more likely that he'd given so much information that Henry VIII let him go. But I actually call in the book, I call it the single biggest surprise I think Henry VIII ever made, because this is a man who is clearly guilty of treason if you accept the Treasons Act. As I said, I don't believe for a moment that he was plotting to kill the king like the rest of them. I don't believe. But he was guilty under the 1534 Treasons Act of saying certain things, and he gets off. Whereas Henry executes people on charges 100th as assured as that. So that was a real surprise move from Henry VIII. And I think the saddest character, actually, is Margaret Pole's grandson. So Henry Pole had a son, another Henry Pole the Younger, who is imprisoned in the Tower of London at the same time. He's only 10, and he simply vanishes. We do not know what happened to him. And because of his royal blood, I refer to him as the third prince in the Tower.
Oh, I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
What happened to Henry Pole the Younger? Yeah. See, that could be a whole new mystery, right?
Absolutely. Who knows? I mean, we do not know what happened to him. It's a genuine, like, we've got even less to go on than the princes in the Tower. We've got nothing to go on. We just know he vanishes. That's all we know.
How old was he?
10.
Yeah, it's so young. Just so many of these young boys. Even when you look at Edward Plantagenet, the Earl of Warwick. Yeah, I mean, and I hate to go so far back in the conversation again, but that's just one of those stories that is absolutely heartbreaking. Like this.
It's so sad. And I don't believe that he was mentally unstable, which a lot of people have also said. I think he was just unworldly. This is a boy who's been imprisoned from the age of 10. There's that famous line about that he couldn't discern a goose from a capon. He'd been in prison since the age of 10. He was probably just very unworldly. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily think he was mentally unstable, but it's a very, very sad story. And I think Henry VII actually did feel very guilty about it, because he allowed Edward, Earl of Warwick, to be buried in the vault of the Warwick family, rather than in the Tower as Margaret would be. So I think that was Henry VII trying to maybe show some level of respect and some, just a bit of feeling a bit guilty about it. But it was one of those things. Yeah.
I just feel like that the whole, like, all the descendants of George, Duke of Clarence, and his wife. I mean, if you look at them from George, let's say, just even through the reign of Henry VIII, how many of them died?
Oh, I mean, well, obviously, George is executed, Margaret's executed, Edward is executed, Margaret's eldest son is executed. You've got so Ursula Pole, the quietest member of the Pole family, she had 14 children, 7 boys, 7 girls, which I've always thought was quite satisfying. One of her sons was beheaded, but on the orders of Queen Mary I. But yeah, that line, the Clarence line, was plagued by executions. And I think, as I say in the book, I think in the end, actually, that it was Margaret's family who had the strongest claim to the throne of England. But in a nice twist of fate, it's always like, so Ursula Pole, as I said, the quietest member of the family easily, and the one we know the least about. But it's her eldest daughter, Dorothy Stafford, who went on to marry the widow of Mary Boleyn. So I've always thought that was an amusing twist, because Margaret and her family were so averse to anything Boleyn. So she'd have been spinning in her grave knowing that her granddaughter went on to marry the widower of Mary Boleyn. But when Dorothy Stafford, so Ursula's eldest daughter, she's very, very close to Elizabeth I. And when she dies, a big plaque is installed at Westminster Abbey, where she's buried, commemorating this woman. And it says on the plaque, granddaughter of the Countess of Salisbury, Margaret Pole, great-granddaughter of George, Duke of Clarence. And that is the only example of Margaret being honoured in a very prominent part of England in Westminster Abbey. So it's kind of this delicious sort of twist of irony that it's the quietest member of the family. It's her daughter that has the ability to honour the family in the way that all of the sons and everyone else could not, which is it's a bit like the whole Anne of Cleves actually having the last laugh,
Mm-hmm.
This was satisfying.
Yeah. Well, Adam, this has been such a joy talking about the Pole family. Was there anything maybe that we didn't cover that in your research you were surprised by?
I think I was actually, the thing that surprised me was discovering that they were guilty in some respects. I think people just go into this expecting that it was just all, that Henry VIII had no justification for doing what he did. So discovering that actually, again, as I've said many times, if we just take it as the law, because that's what it was, then there, at least under the law of the day, there was some justification for some of what Henry VIII did. So I think that was the big surprise. And then just the fact that they really couldn't catch a break a lot of the time. So something we haven't really covered is the marriages of Margaret Pole's children. Because when she is re-established, she gets the lands and titles back, becomes very, very wealthy again. One of the first things she does is goes shopping for spouses for her children, because she knows very, very well that that's the way to advance, your family further. And in time-honored tradition, she marries the children off into other notable families. And these marriages, which on paper look like they'd be brilliant, end up actually causing them so much heartache. So the sort of the biggest cock up was Ursula's marriage. The marriage itself went very well, but Ursula was married to Henry Stafford, who was the heir of Edward Stafford, the third Duke of Buckingham. So that meant that in time, Ursula, all being well, would have become the Duchess of Buckingham, outranking her mother, being after the Queen and the King's daughters, actually the most senior female in the country, because the Buckingham dukedom was the most senior in rank. So that was this glittering future for Ursula Pole sort of locked in. And then in 1522, her father-in-law, the Duke of Buckingham, falls from favour, is executed. And so that glittering future is destroyed, basically. And for the rest of her, well, they only get a title back in the reign of Edward VI, when Ursula's husband's made Baron Stafford. Baron is the lowest in the rank of the noble titles. It's a title, but by no means a dukedom. So that marriage with so much promise. Yes, the marriage was very strong. They had 14 children, but from a wealth perspective, didn't deliver. And it was the same for Arthur and Geoffrey's marriages. They just didn't. They couldn't catch a break. For example, Geoffrey's marriage was to a woman called Constance, and her and her sister were the sole heiresses of a very wealthy man. He then remarries, has loads more children. So suddenly the inheritance that was due to come to Constance and by extension then to Geoffrey, that suddenly massively watered down. Henry Pole's marriage suffers as well, because when the Duke of Buckingham fell, the Duke of Buckingham's son-in-law was George Neville, 5th Baron Berger-Venny, and his son-in-law was Henry Pole. So we've just got this huge... These marriages that should have been great end up delivering very little for the Pole family. And that was something I didn't really know about properly until doing my research, just how much bad luck they had, really.
Yeah, a lot of bad luck. Well, Adam, I want people to go out and get your book, so I don't want to ask you any more questions because I've got to leave something to the imagination, and I want people to pick up your book. So if somebody wants to purchase your book, where can they find it?
It's on Amazon, so just head straight to Amazon, search for Henry VIII and the Plantagenet Poles, and you'll find it there.
And I'll include a link in the show notes as well to make it extra easy to go purchase the book. Adam, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the invitation.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.